The Kalb Report is funded by a grant from the Ethics and Excellence in Journalism Foundation. From the National Press Club in Washington, D.C., this is the Kalb Report with Marvin Kalb.
Hello and welcome to the National Press Club and to another edition of the Kalb Report. I'm Marvin Kalb, and our subject tonight, Putin's Trump card, a discussion of the troubled state of U.S.-Russian relations. Ever since Donald Trump arrived on the national and global scene only a few short years ago, his dealings with Vladimir Putin of Russia have fascinated and, on occasion, even frightened people everywhere. Was it really a bromance, as it was put early on, or did Putin have something on Trump? Why did Putin really intervene in the 2016 presidential elections? Was Trump pathetically naive about Putin and his sharp-elbowed policies? What was going on? In the absence of clear answers, relations between the two countries, as we know, have soured very badly. There's been talk of a new Cold War. The awesome might of the Russian and American military machines have been an almost daily display in the Middle East, just the other day in Syria, and also in the Baltic region. So again, I ask, what is going on? So I've assembled a panel of four very well-informed people to help us come up with an answer, and I'm going to give them the better part of an hour to do so. To my right, only a geographic designation, I quickly add, John Allen, a retired four-star Marine general, now president of the Brookings Institution. His long career spans war and diplomacy. He was commander of NATO's 150,000 troops in the Afghan war from 2011 to 2013. And he served as a special presidential envoy to the Middle East in the fight against ISIS. To my left, also geography, Leon Aron, who is director of Russian studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Born in Moscow, he came to the U.S. in 1978, earned his PhD at Columbia University, and has become one of Washington's top specialists on Russian affairs. To my immediate right, Mary Louise Kelly, who is co-host of All Things Considered, NPR's award-winning news magazine. She was NPR's national security correspondent, once worked for CNN and the BBC, and she's just back from Moscow, where she reported on Putin's recent flirtation with the idea of a presidential election. And to my immediate left, Peter Baker, who is the chief White House correspondent for the New York Times, covering President Trump. He also covered three other presidents, Obama, Bush, and Clinton. He was also the Moscow bureau chief for the Washington Post, and he worked at the Post for some 20 years. So, dear panelists, tell us what is going on. Are we really in the depths of a new Cold War? Or can something happen yet that could turn it around and open the way toward a more civil conversation? I'd like to start with John Allen.
Well, Marvin, thank you very much for the opportunity to join you this evening in this wonderful panel. It's great to be with so many members of the Fourth Estate, the media. And being a Marine for so many years, I never thought I'd find myself in a position where I was thanking the media for your service. Well done to you, keeping up the pressure. Look, we all hope that in some form or another we can find common purpose with any potential adversary of the United States. And I think by almost any measure, we find now that we and Russia, our particular leaders in particular, are in a moment of crisis, a moment of confrontation. And we ought to look for ways that we can have a conversation that finds common purpose potential common interests. But that's going to be very difficult to find these days.
But you do accept the idea of being in a new Cold War?
I'm not sure I would put that term to it, but I would say the level of confrontation that we have with the Russians today is exceptional in the period in the aftermath of the Cold War. Now, whether they want that or not remains to be determined, but we are certainly headed towards a level of confrontation that has the potential for even a military confrontation, as we saw just 2 nights ago.
Oh dear. Mary Louise Kelly, your view, please.
Sergei Lavrov, Russia's foreign minister, was interviewed on the BBC this morning, asked the same question. He said relations have never been worse.
Never been worse.
Never been worse, and he explicitly included the Cold War. I guess I don't find the Cold War frame that useful in the sense that the Cold War referred to such a binary world. We're in such a different place. You know, it was dueling superpowers with a existential ideological clash. That's not where we are. And I suppose also if you think about the end goal, I was in the room recently where John McLaughlin, the former acting head of the CIA, got asked about this, and he said, you know, the Cold War ended. The Soviet Union went away. Russia isn't going to go away. It's not going to disappear. So where does this end? So U.S.-Russia relations, clearly, you can argue about are they better or are they worse than they were on the cusp of the Cuban Missile Crisis. They're bad. But new Cold War, I'm not sure.
Okay. Peter Baker, your view, please.
Well, I agree a lot with what Mary Louise said. I think that we use a new Cold War phrase, probably in the media too loosely, but mainly the idea is to emphasize the idea that we are back into an adversarial posture that we had hoped to get away from after 1991. And for about 10 years or so, maybe 15, we were away from it. Under Clinton and Yeltsin, we had disputes over, obviously, Kosovo and other issues, but for the most part, we were, we believed that we were friends and partners. And for the beginning of the Bush administration, I think that was also the case, particularly after 9/11. I was in Moscow at that time. Vladimir Putin reached out. Bush accepted there was a convergence of interests. I'd say since 2003 or so, with the Iraq War, with Putin's increasing consolidation of power, we've headed different directions. And I don't know that is the fault of any individual actor, but we are definitely on the opposite sides at this point of a struggle. It's not an ideological struggle, right? Putin is not a communist, capital C. He's a Soviet, perhaps, but he's not a communist, and he's not hoping to export an ideology around the world. He is, however, hoping to make Russia great again, to prove that Russia is a major actor on the stage, and if that means putting Ukraine in its place, if that means propping up Bashar al-Assad, he's willing to do that.
Leon Aron, Cold War, and what can be done to turn it around?
Well, I mean, this the situation reminds me of that old Soviet joke where, who is the Soviet pessimist? The Soviet pessimist is somebody says things will get worse. And who is the Soviet optimist? And the Soviet optimist says things are so bad they cannot possibly get worse. I think we've reached this point of Soviet optimism. The problem is, to me, maybe because I look at it always from the Russian side, is that sometime, probably around 2012, going to his third presidency, Putin made a choice, probably the most consequential choice of his political career. And that is, he shifted the basis of the legitimacy of his regime, or his own popularity, which is the same. The only thing that goes for this regime is his personal popularity. He began to shift it from what had cemented it before, which is a very substantial economic growth and growth of incomes, to what I call patriotic mobilization, some of my Russian colleagues call militarized patriotism. He's looking at a very bleak economic situation unless he undertakes the reforms. Everybody tells him that. He cannot undertake structural reforms. He cannot confront corruption. He cannot stop this nationwide racketeering by bureaucracy without endangering his regime. And so therefore, he shifted the basis of his regime's legitimacy and his personal popularity from the wealth manager to the defender of the country, the restorer of the glory of the Soviet Union, because Putin is a Soviet patriot. You were absolutely right, far more than he's a Russian patriot.
So what does it mean in terms of the relationship with the U.S.? What is his end game? What does he want out of the relationship with the U.S.?
I think this is the, I don't want to use the term tragedy, but this is a very bad situation, because so long as Putin depends on confrontation with the United States, and you were at the election, his speech on March 1st, his State of Russia address, right, in my mind, was the most militaristic, the most chauvinistic speech by any Soviet or Russian leader since Stalin. You have to go to 1949, 1950. So long as he bases his popularity, and it's there, it's genuine, on being the defender of the country, the vanquisher of the hated West, I think it's very difficult for us to do anything about it.
Louise, where would you put us at this point? At a stage where the idea of improvement in the relationship is so far removed that we have to deal with this negativity all the time? Or is there a way that you can imagine this relationship still turning around and moving in a positive direction?
That's such a good question. I was struck by something I read this morning. Might have been in the Times, might have probably your piece, Peter, I can't remember. Allow me to quote it to you. It was Angela Stent, who's now a professor at Georgetown, was a longtime intelligence officer here in the U.S. Was this your story?
No.
Okay, good.
Should have been.
She was quoted as talking about U.S.-Russia relations and saying one of the challenges is the U.S. has 3 different Russia policies. There's President Trump's policy, vision of Russia, vision of where he would like this relationship to go. There's his administration's Russia policy, which sometimes differs quite sharply with President Trump's own expressed stated views. And then there's where Congress has weighed in with sanctions and where lawmakers appear to be on all of this. And those 3 do not operate in tandem, which perhaps is a strategic plus if you're operating on the premise that keeping Putin off his guard is a good way to go. I mean, clearly there's room for improvement. Clearly there are areas for improvement and cooperation. But, you know, as I was getting dressed this morning, getting ready for this panel, I was thinking it's kind of a shame this wasn't last week, because the focus today will be so on Syria. Russia feels a little weird to be talking about, you know, a panel exclusively about Russia. And then, you know, just in the last 24 hours or so, we have seen, you know, the U.S. accusing, international inspectors, but with the U.S. not flagging us, steering us away from reports that Russia perhaps went and meddled with the chemical site, the site that international inspectors are trying to get to in Duma in Syria. There are reports out U.S., UK accusing Russia of massive cyber intrusions. That's all coming out today. It's not entirely clear, speaking of different U.S. policies, whether the U.S. is about to impose more sanctions on Russia in response to Duma. It depends on if you're listening to Nikki Haley or to the White House. It can't go anywhere from up, to cite your Russian optimist view.
Let me ask John Allen, from your perspective, John, as you're looking at this problem now, what is the greatest strategic challenge to the United States at this point?
Well, there's several, Marvin. I think one of the things that the Russians have done quite well is to create a relatively modern capability of conducting operations, coherent military operations in all of the 6 domains. So on the ground, on the sea, under the sea, in the air, in the cyber domain, and ultimately in space. And they're actually quite sophisticated in that regard. They've also mastered the capability of conducting operations in what we call the gray zone, which are operations that can accomplish their objectives, but are not so provocative, any one of them, that it breaks the threshold potentially for a NATO reaction or a UN reaction. They have mastered that. From my perspective, the great strategic confrontation that we have with the Russians is that they have meddled in the internal affairs of the United States and our electoral processes to the direct detriment of our democratic institutions in the United States. It's difficult to defend against that, but in the end, the 2016 election is characterized by a level of interference, a strategic influence operation far beyond simple cyber operations, strategic influence operations that had, I think, dramatic potential impact on that election. And it continues to this day. And so what's happened is not only do we, I think the intelligence community knows pretty well, not only do we not know the full extent of the intrusion of the Russian cyber and influence operations, what's happened is it has caused, I think, a very important outcome for Vladimir Putin, which is it has caused a crisis of confidence in democratic societies, in their electoral processes, and their systems of truth. It has really compromised people's ability to trust their government, trust truth, and to trust their electoral processes. That is a strategic outcome where he didn't have to fire a shot to accomplish that.
Peter, do you think that was his end game? Do you think that's what he started having in his mind when he launched this project?
I think the available evidence suggests that he started with the idea of disruption, morphed a little bit to the idea of revenge at Hillary Clinton, who he did not like and whom he blamed for fomenting street revolts when he came back to the presidency. And then once they recognized that there was possibly an opportunity, morphed again into support in an overt way for another candidate, for Donald Trump. Did they think they were going to actually elect Trump? Probably not. They read the same polls we did. They saw that little dial thing on the New York Times website that we all saw. But they did sort of move from a generalized, let's mess things up and make them all doubt their own system, to hey, let's throw our side toward one candidate. And that's without debate, really. We see this in an email that was sent to Donald Trump Jr. We would like you to meet with this woman, Natalia Veselnitskaya, for the purpose of receiving incriminating information about Hillary Clinton as part of the Russian government's support of Mr. Trump. There's no question about that. And I think that they did not understand what would happen once they did that. And I don't think they've gotten what they wanted out of it necessarily, except for the disruption part.
Now, that was called collusion. That word was used rather widespread. Leon, I have heard you talk very eloquently against the idea that there was collusion in 2016 between the Trump campaign and the Russian government. Please explain that.
Well, there may very well have been one. We should check and we should wait for the reports. Again, I have zero knowledge of this administration. Actually, it's the first administration that kind of did not really need my expertise, Republican or Democratic. But from the Russian side, I do know a few things. And the first thing I would say is that no responsible Russian intelligence officer would expose a truly valuable asset by connecting. Remember, until October, it was out of the realm of possibility that Trump would win. You were right. And besides, this was a campaign that was so disorderly and chaotic that you truly would have thought twice or three times before you get involved. Now, speaking of people they met, I think anybody who's been to Moscow, I was a lowly foreign policy advisor to Governor Romney when he ran. And even I got phone calls like this. Oh, you know what? Let's meet, and we will. You'll get the ear of Sergei Lavrov, or all the way to the president. These are, from what I've seen, the names so far are bottom-crawling, third-rate hustlers, and so far I have not seen anything better than that. Now, what happened is that this immense pressure to please the czar however you want, however you can do it, who knows, maybe you could come up with something, because they all knew that it was anti-Hillary. You're absolutely right. I have a wonderful poster here to show later. But you know, once I got those calls, you know, you don't even send your research assistant, you send an unpaid intern to meet with them, who usually comes back and he says that's a waste of time. So what you had is this immense pressure by these third-rate, bottom-crawling hustlers, and absolutely bad judgment, total lack of professionalism on behalf of the Trump campaign.
And the Russians are perfectly capable of being that foolish and going with third-rate people and screwing it all up. They are perfectly capable of doing that. So it is possible that you can have collusion and lousy, ineffective Senate. It is possible.
Well, absolutely, no, it is possible.
The Soviet system was almost based on that principle.
It is possible. Yes, it is absolutely possible. It's just I think it's easier to have a collusion with people who know what they're doing than the other way around.
Okay, fair enough, fair enough. Mary Louise, you were recently in Moscow and covering the election of Putin to another term. I remember many years ago, most of the time, the Russian people were very friendly toward Americans. Even the Russian government would say nice things about the United States every now and then. What is it like there today? I hear that it's kind of harsh and tough. What was your experience?
Well, we didn't have a lot of love and welcoming open arms from the Russian government, I'll say that. But in terms of people talking to you, it's a surprise to me every time I go, because you think, you know, I show up with my microphone and my interpreter and my producer. What does anybody have to gain from speaking to me? And that's the case here, but at least here they know what NPR is, that we're going to hopefully there's some trust that we're going to try to be objective and not mangle their quotes. And what does a Russian have to gain by speaking to me? And just to take election day itself, I'll take 2 moments that bookended it. Woke up, polls open at 8 a.m. It's a Sunday. I knew it was going to be a long day, so I had summoned the willpower to get up early and go to my hotel gym and work out. And the newscast calls as I'm on the treadmill, which is always the way. And they're like, can you just file quickly? Polls have opened, or, can we? And I thought, I just want to put eyeballs on that directly before I tell you that. I know they're supposed to have opened, but I just want to see it. And there was a poll on the same block as our hotel in central Moscow. So I exit the treadmill. I'm sweaty. I'm disgusting. I haven't had my coffee. I think I've brushed my teeth, but borderline there. Run, I just want to see that the doors are open and that there are people going into the polls. And I don't have my interpreter with me. I don't speak Russian. They are crazy for passes, press passes, all the bureaucracy. You have to go, have multiple documents before you head out to report. I've got nothing on me other than my room key. I show up, I'm just trying to kind of lurk around, see that people are coming and going from the poll, and these 2 big security guys with their guns and their uniform and their helmets, and they've got the full body armor on, come chasing and yelling at me in Russian. And I'm thinking, oh no, I've probably crossed some line I didn't know was there, like literally a physical line that only Russians are allowed beyond. And I don't have any of my credentials, and they're going to come arrest me, and that'll be the end of it. I don't have my phone, I've got nothing. And it eventually, with a lot of sign language and my pidgin Russian and a kind Russian who stepped in and started interpreting, it emerges they're worried. They can tell I'm a clueless Western journalist, and I can't find my way into the poll, apparently. And they're there to show me and escort me in, and they want to show me the ballot box and show me how everybody's IDs are being checked and that it's all legit and make sure that I'm good. They're offering me, they've got coffee set out, and wow. This was a big thing with this election is they're trying to make it kind of a fair carnival atmosphere. So this is a fun thing to do, to come vote, because we can get to this, but Putin wants turnout. He wants everybody to come vote. So they're serving coffee and selling, smoked fish outside, and they're plying me with all this stuff. Anyway, I go back and report all this on the NPR newscast, but I thought, as a Western journalist, you have access, and people are leaving the polls, and to a fault, almost everybody who I stopped and stuck a microphone in their face, once I got my producer and interpreter there, would stop and tell me who they voted for and why and what their background was. You can move around. You never quite know to what extent you're being monitored as a journalist.
But it is true that in the last 15, 20 years, there has been an opening. Russians are more willing to deal with foreigners now than they ever have been before. And you were there at a time when Putin was trying to make a point.
He was trying to make a point,
you
and he
sort of
wanted
fit in
Westerners to.
very happily
He wanted
at that point.
Exactly, and you're aware of that. I will say one other point, which is when I was there last summer with protests, and we were watching security guards club protesters and drag them off into vans in front of us. And I stood there witnessing it and reporting live for NPR and looking around, and there are no Russian journalists there. They're banned from covering that on state TV. So if you were a Russian and didn't follow English language media, you would never have known about this pro-Navalny protest happening right there on Pushkinskaya and how it was playing out.
I want to take a moment now to identify ourselves for the many national and global websites that are carrying this edition of the Kalb Report. I'm Marvin Kalb here at the National Press Club, and I'm discussing the fraught nature of U.S.-Russian relations with John Allen, Mary Louise Kelly, Peter Baker, and Leon Aron. My next question is for the two panelists who are not journalists, and that's John Allen and Leon Aron. What stories in your mind, I mean, you keep reading about this subject, what stories in your mind are really important about the nature of the relationship that are not being reported, either properly or adequately at all? Let's start with John.
I think that while you see it touched on in some of the stories, I think the inherent vulnerability of the Western democracies to digital intrusion and massive influence operations deserves a lot more coverage. We have seen the outcome of the migration out of the Middle East, which has, in many respects, created a moment of polarization in the politics of Europe, which I believe in many respects were accelerated and enabled by this influence campaign, which appealed through the internet and through digital media in ways we've never seen before. What we're looking at Brookings now is the traditional concept of sovereignty, the Westphalian concept of sovereignty, which is a line on the ground which encloses terrain and people and resources, ultimately to have a self-identity which is completely turned on its head today. The capacity of the Russians or the Chinese or pick an opponent to completely neutralize the traditional concepts of sovereignty at a digital level and come straight into the consciousness of the individual citizens, regardless of what the central government would want to have happen or not have happen. This has really turned Westphalian concepts of sovereignty on its head. We really need to understand that, because if this is warfare of the future or influence of the future, how does the traditional concept of the nation state defend itself in this environment? I think we need more coverage in that.
Thank you, John. Leon, your sense, the story that is not covered adequately?
Again, as the general said, it's being touched upon all the time, but maybe not all the dots are connected. And that's a very peculiar nature of the Putin regime, which is why it's not the Cold War. But I'm not sure I think it's even less predictable than the Cold War. And the reason for that is because he based his legitimacy, as I said, on his foreign policy confrontation with the West. And once you saddle that tiger, it's very difficult to get off, and the tiger requires more and more meat. It's not a new problem. I think somewhere towards the end of Henry IV, Shakespeare's Henry IV, the dying Henry IV tells Prince Hal, former, future Henry V, be that thy rule to occupy giddy minds with foreign quarrels. This is something that Putin is doing. I have a poster which you've seen, but I would like to show. It's a classic 1949 Soviet Cold War poster, a Russian soldier lecturing Uncle Sam, or berating. So the soldier is very handsome, he's confident, on his very, 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 very broad chest is the Golden Star of the Hero of the Soviet Union, which is the highest award, military award. In his hand, quite easy to read, is the history of World War II. The implication being the enemy is different, but the outcome is going to be the same. Uncle Sam, of course, holds the nuclear bomb and a torch to set the world on fire if the Russian soldier allows him. And his ugly face is contorted by impotent hatred. And the caption could be loosely translated as "Don't you fool around." This is a sensibility that Putin instilled in Russia quite successfully. The loathing, the fear, but also the pride. And this is a very dangerous road to take.
Thank you very much, Leon. My next question to the two journalists on the panel. I have been told by many of your colleagues how difficult it is to cover President Trump, that he simply dominates everything in the environment, and therefore you get caught up on any given day covering the story that he sort of presents to you. So what is the story that you would really like to cover, but you don't have the time to do that right now? And I'll start with Peter.
I'm so exhausted getting through the day that it's hard to imagine. You know, you're right. I mean, he is a remarkable force of nature when it comes to news generation in a way I've never seen. This is my fourth president. I've never seen anything like it. In the other presidencies, you would wake up in the morning, you have some sense of what the day was going to bring. You knew what the storylines could be, or at least what direction it might possibly go. I wake up now and I have no clue what I'm going to be writing about by the end of the day. And it may be something I never would have imagined would be the subject of a story. And so in that environment, as you say, to kind of escape that vortex and focus on something of our own, ambition, is a challenge. And we have, at the Times, met that challenge, I hope, by increasing our staff. We now have 6 people cover the White House full-time. When I started 22 years ago, it was 2 people. We now have 107 people in our Washington bureau. That's up from 70 before Trump took office. We have a full-time team that does nothing but cover, investigate the Russia stuff and now the Cohen stuff in New York. And we try to peel off people so they can get outside of that vortex for a while to do bigger stories. And if you ask me what story I would like to do, I'd like to understand better the NSC process. I would like to understand the national security team, especially as we now reconstituted under John Bolton, the new national security advisor. And we will have Mike Pompeo there as Secretary of State. I'd like to understand better who's running things. We saw, as Mary Louise just mentioned, Nikki Haley yesterday say we're going to put new sanctions on Russia on Monday. Today we said, no, we're not. No. And I'd like to understand that dynamic a little better.
No.
Mary Louise, your sense?
I mean, the Nikki Haley were slapping new sanctions on Trump, saying, oh, no, we're not. Nobody in the White House seems to quite know, and here we are, and we'll figure it out. It speaks to one of the challenges as a reporter of covering this administration, as it used to be if you got a whiff of a story and you started reporting it out and you got to the point where you were, in my case, covering the national security beat, ready to take it to the CIA for comment, that they often wouldn't confirm it on the record, but you might get some kind of steer, and that meant something. And now, who do you go to and get a steer, and it means this story is true and you've nailed it? You could get the president's national security advisor. You could get the president himself confirming your story, and 6 hours later have the rug pulled out from under you. So
in other words, the idea of the old 2 sources before you go with a story, forget that. Right?
Forget that. And to Peter's point about the craziness of the news cycle, we at NPR used to scale down our staffing on the weekends. We had we were fully staffed, but there was less news on the weekend. That's now changed when the president gets up and tweets before his golf game and changes the world's agenda for the day on a Saturday morning. We, at All Things Considered, were a 2-hour show, but it's staggered so that you get the latest news on the East Coast and the West Coast. I used to go home at, 6:30, 7. You could kind of count the East Coast was shutting down unless there's a huge California story moving. You could update 1 or 2 things from home, you were okay. As of last week, our new schedule is we're staffed fully till 10 o'clock every night. You take Friday night, where it was my turn to be there till 10 o'clock on Friday night, and of course that didn't cut it because we were launching airstrikes on Syria, so I was there till midnight doing live updates for the West Coast, and that's our congressional correspondent who was in the studio with me, Sue Davis, tweeted out from the studio this kind of picture of all the mics lit up, and it was 10:37 p.m. and the caption was "Typical Friday night in the Trump era." We're all in the studio. We don't quite know what's happening, but here we are. We're doing a live broadcast about it.
Peter, in this era of fake news, alternative facts, that concept that President Trump has introduced to Washington, 2 questions, really. One, when you look at the 4 presidents you've covered, is Trump the leakiest?
That's a great question, and it's funny to say yes, because I've just spent all day today just tearing my hair out because I can't get anybody to talk to me. And so it's an odd dynamic where we know more in some ways about what happens inside this White House than we did other White Houses. They do not have the discipline of a Bush White House, which is pretty disciplined. They do not have the discipline of an Obama White House, which was fairly disciplined. The Clinton White House had no discipline, but they don't even have that. And so, having said that, they're also not particularly responsive when you're trying to get them on, or I'm trying to get them on the phone. They have some reporters they deal with more frequently than others. And the problem is that just as you finally make a source and get a relationship with somebody that you might begin to trust on that steer that you're looking for, they're out.
Yeah.
And you have to start all over again.
Yeah.
And so in some ways, yes, the leakiest White House, but also to me, the least responsive that I've dealt with.
John Allen, this world of the fake news, alternative fact, how does that affect the ability of a 4-star Marine general to do his work? Are you isolated from that world, or are you affected by that world, and if so, how?
Me as a general or me as the president of Brookings?
Either one you like.
Well,
I had in mind being a general.
From the no less a person as the White House spokesperson, Sarah once said that we're not in the business of questioning 4-star generals. So I take that to the bank. Okay. This is an extraordinary challenge for organizations like AEI and Brookings right now, because when you find yourself in an environment where there are alternative facts, and people point to alternative facts as the genuine basis for opinions. We used to say you can have your own opinions, but you can't have your own facts. We have the fake news, we have alternative facts, and what this has done is it's been really a challenge for think tanks. And from my perspective, as we do business at Brookings, and my guess would be that Arthur Brooks feels the same way at AEI, our obligation, first of all, our role has never been more important to the American public in producing quality research that is as accurate as we can possibly make it at any particular moment, to give the American people a basis for a place to go and a basis to find the closest thing to truth that is available. Now, truth will be revised as more facts become available, et cetera, but we have that obligation to the people of the United States, but very importantly, we have that obligation to the administration. One of the mottos that I've brought to Brookings is that we will help the president to govern and help the Congress to legislate. And that means an unrelenting commitment to quality and an unrelenting commitment to truth as much as we possibly can, and provide that to the policymakers, but also provide that to the American people. But in an environment where even in the White House, there is an unrelenting stream of falsehoods that are coming out. It's very difficult to compete against that. So the challenge for think tanks at this point in the 21st century is to be that basis for unqualified truth upon which the American people can judge their own positions, but also policymakers and regulators, et cetera, can then base quality policy development.
Thank you, John. Mary Louise, the President, as you know, has referred to the American press as the enemies of the American people. And I'm wondering, in your judgment, do you think he is serious about that, or is it just for show?
I have no idea. If you figure it out, let me know.
Thank you for your service. But once again.
I mean, without stretching this parallel too far, I will say the last couple times I've reported from Russia, I was struck thinking, if you look at Washington, you look at Moscow, both are places where the leader is attacking the press, attacking and targeting the press. Both are places where the president either jails his political enemies or threatens to. Both are places where the legislative branch either can't or won't exert much of a check on executive power. That said, I was in Moscow when Jim Comey did his big headline testimony last June, I guess it was, right after he'd been fired. Mm-hmm. And the first time he spoke publicly after that. And it was surreal to sit in Moscow watching the just fired FBI director criticize the sitting American president and think, that wouldn't happen in Russia. He would have been hauled off to jail. Mm-hmm. And there are still real and important and deep structural differences.
Right. Peter, when you're there every day at the White House, and that line is thrown at you, mm-hmm. What was in his mind? Was he serious about that? Was it a joke?
Well, as somebody from the failing New York Times, I can tell you that he likes lying. Let me just say, by the way, New York Times doing great. I hope we keep failing the way we're failing. The readership's way up. Thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Won a couple of Pulitzers today.
We won a few Pulitzers today,
including
on our Russia coverage, along with our great friends and competitors at the Washington Post. Stock prices up. So, we're failing upwards, which is, like a classic Washington phenomenon.
But give me your sense of Trump's...
Look, people ask us a lot. There's a lot of bark. So far, there hasn't been a lot of bite. Now, the bark is not insignificant. The bark is meaningful. The bark cuts away at our credibility, which is the intent, right? It's to treat us as another political actor who shouldn't be believed because that's in the interest of the president.
What aim is solved when doing that?
Well, to discredit what we would report.
Why?
Because then he can tell his supporters that it's not true what they're saying and you can believe me. And he has successfully bypassed the media with a Twitter account that every president before him would have loved to have been able to do. And he's the first one to have the capacity and the willingness and the ferocity to genuinely bypass the media. Now, having said that, on a day in, day out basis, as a White House reporter who's there every day, it sounds more bark than bite. He talks about going after NBC's license, but he hasn't done that. He talks about throwing us out of the West Wing, but he hasn't done that. After the first few months where there was this, tension with Sean Spicer, will the cameras be on, not be on, Sarah Sanders, to her credit, has calmed things down, and we have more or less regular briefings, and we have more or less, adversarial but polite back and forth. So my daily life is not changed in a significant way. Where I worry, and where I say we as journalists ought to say something, is when that translates into tangible impact on our ability to do our job, tangible impact on our access, or tangible impact as retaliation against organizations that dare to write things that he doesn't like. That's where I think we should worry. I don't worry about the name calling. He'll be at a rally and he'll gin people up and says the media is this, the fake media, enemy of the people, all that stuff, and the people in the rally will turn around, they'll shout at us and they'll scream at us, and that's not pleasant. But it is what it is. Then he gets on the plane, he comes back in the back of the plane and says, hey guys, how's it going? Everybody had a good time? In the end, he's a hotelier, kind of making sure the guests are having a good time. Well, sir, you kind of gave it to us pretty good. Well, so some of it is real. He has deep grievances about the media. I don't think that's fake. At the same time, it's also a good show. I don't think it's either or. I think it's both.
Okay. Leon, when you think about Putin for a sec and measure him up against Peter the Great, Nicholas I, Stalin, is he in the long-term tradition of Russian historical leaders, nationalist leaders, or does he represent something new that we have to be super concerned about?
I think he represents a significant deviation from that line.
He does?
Yes.
In what way?
Well, if you remember, Max Weber's three categories of legitimacy, it's either traditional, or it's legal, which is democratic, or it's charismatic. I think Putin wants to be a charismatic leader. The Russian sovereigns that you mentioned, they dabbled. Catherine the Great grabbed, half of Poland and Crimea from the Turks. Yes, we expand, that's fine. But they had inherent legitimacy. They had legitimacy by virtue of being czars or emperors. Putin did not have that legitimacy. He gained it because in the first 8 years of his rule, plus he used the Russian Soviet capacities still unused, oil doubled in price every couple of years. Our common friend, unfortunately much more Boris Nemtsov, who was murdered outside Kremlin, the real opposition leader whom Putin really was afraid of. I was once on a panel with him, and he asked the audience, how long do you think Putin would have lasted if the oil price during his rule was the same as under Yeltsin, which was $18 a barrel? And then Nemtsov answered his own question, and he said, I'd say on the third day he would be carried out of the Kremlin on pitchforks. So when the economy is down and the oil is not likely to go much higher than it is today, probably lower, you base your legitimacy on confrontation with the West. The czars didn't have to do it.
Mm-hmm. No, in fact, the czars got on with the U.S. pretty well. Oh. Let me ask this question of all of you, and it sort of flows out of what Leon was now talking about. If I were to ask you to please consider the state of U.S.-Russian relations 5 or 10 years into the future, will we be dealing essentially with the same strategic problems, the same challenges, or is it going to be something quite different? And we're going to have to figure out how to deal with a new Russia rather than a Russia that's just a little older. John, why don't you start us?
Well, I think it follows what I said a few minutes ago. I think we're going to have to deal with a Russia that will have mastered the capacity in the context of influence operations to have interfered in the internal affairs of many of the countries in Europe and elsewhere. I spent a lot of time in Central Europe and in the Balkans, and seeing them under direct assault by the various mechanisms of influence that Russia can bring to bear, I really worry about the state of democracy in Europe 5 to 10 years from now.
Let me interrupt you and ask specifically the Middle East. Will it still be that same big power confrontation, the competition for influence, one side up, the other side up? Will it be the same?
Well, the Middle East, completely apart from the fact that the Russians are deeply involved and there seems to be a strategic standoff between the United States and Russia, the Middle East has multiple massive structural flaws that are manifesting themselves now that are being frankly exacerbated by now the presence of strategic competitors in the region. So I don't think that the Middle East, frankly, is going to be dramatically different 5 years from now. We will still probably be fighting in Syria 5 years from now. The question then becomes, will the United States, under President Trump, have reasserted American presence, which frankly most of our Arab allies thirst for. They're desperate for the reinsertion of American presence in the aftermath of the Obama administration's largely a policy of departure. But the structural flaws that first manifested themselves in the so-called Arab Spring have swept across the region in ways that will take years to recover from. So I think 5 to 10 years from now, the Middle East is not going to be dramatically different. It may have been changed in some respects by great power competition, but I think those structural flaws and the failings in the Middle East will still continue.
Peter, do you think in the next 5 years to 10 that there could be a war between the two?
I worry more about a cyber kind of confrontation than a physical, old-fashioned military confrontation. Although, as you say, with Syria, you could have easily seen that, escalate by accident into something. We saw recently the DHS put out a report saying that the Russian hackers, state actors, had tried to penetrate the power grid and had shown basically they could do it. I think they were trying to test them, and I think they were trying to send us a message. And I think that's the battleground of the future that I would worry most about.
Leon?
I think it might, well, look, Putin is there forever. He is a wartime president. That's how he positioned himself inside the country.
No one is there forever.
Yeah. He's a healthy 66-year-old. He swims for 2 hours before work while his ministers are sitting around the pool waiting for him to come out. He also plays hockey and, believe it or not, scores most of the goals for his team.
No, I believe that.
Do you?
Put him on the Capitol.
His team also usually wins. He's very healthy and occasional, Botox in the face. He stepped on that escalator. Muammar Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein. He's not stepping off, and that tiger that he settled requires a lot of meat. And my greatest concern is his poking on the eastern flank of NATO.
Let me switch slightly here, Mary Louise, and ask you, not so much looking into the future, but right now, if you had an opportunity, if you had the power, excuse me, if you had the power to take one step that would improve the relationship between the two countries, what would that one step be? I know it's a challenge, but...
That is a challenging question for a non-policymaker.
What
Change the heads of state of each country? Can we do that?
Go ahead.
I mean, you speak to the point that I was going to make, which is the big question everybody in Russia was talking about. To sharpen your question, it's not where we'll be in 5 or 10 years, it's where will we be in 6. It's 2024. Putin has not shown a taste for wanting to share power or step aside. So what happens in 6 years when he's constitutionally prohibited from standing again? Does he groom a successor now? Does he change the constitution? Does he create some kind of new Khamenei in Iran-style supreme leader role? While these two personalities are leading these two countries, it's both utterly unpredictable and completely predictable at once.
I'm going to ask you because our time is running short. Leon, one step, what would you recommend now?
I'm at a loss. Essentially, again, it's up to the Russian people to decide the fate of U.S.-Russian relations.
No, but that means that there's nothing we can do?
There is nothing we can do substantially. We should go back to George Kennan and try to contain this Russia as much as we can without coming to blows.
Peter, what do you think? Any step, I'm trying to search for a positive end to this program. And are we really at a point, we don't have much time, so I'm just kidding. What do you think?
I'll give you a positive end. So Leon told us what a Soviet optimist is like. I remember Grigory Yavlinsky, who was an opposition leader, still is, I guess, was asked once at a forum, he says, is democracy dead in Russia? And I think we could pose the question, is the future of Russian-American relations dead? He says, look, it's like an old Russian anecdote. He says, man's in an ambulance, they're heading down the highway, the man in the back hears the driver say, I'm heading to the morgue. And the guy in the back, heads up, I'm not dead yet. He says, we're not there yet.
John, one step, briefly. Could you
I have difficulty finding one, frankly.
Okay, I want to throw in my one step. Because I've been going in and out of this country now since the mid-1950s. And I remember, even in the worst times of the Cold War, there was an active cultural and student exchange program. And time again, first-rate American artists would be performing in the Soviet Union, and the Russian people loved it.
Well, Van Cliburn.
Absolute, Van Cliburn being a very good example. So my one step right now would be that in the midst of all this negativity, if we could somehow persuade President Trump to launch a new cultural and student exchange program, have people going back and forth. And I think that would really be a wonderful step toward proving to the Russians, proving to the Russians that the Americans don't have horns, and that the Russians are not really bears. But at this point, the clock says to me that I have to begin to wrap up. And I want first to thank the many news outlets and websites for carrying the Kalb report. And then I want to thank our wonderful audience here at the National Press Club. But most important, I want to thank our four panelists, John Allen, Mary Louise Kelly, Peter Baker, and Leon Aron, for taking the time to be with us and for sharing your insights on a question of really supreme importance right now to this country and to the rest of the world. And that is it. And as Ed Murrow used to say many, many years ago, good night and good luck. Well, so I have asked all of my questions now. That's not quite true, but I've asked as many as I can. And we have now microphones. Where are they? Right here and there. So if you'd like to ask a question, come up to the microphone, give us your name, your association with some organization or another, and ask a question. And I ask that because if you make a speech, I'll probably cut you off. So ask your question. Please go ahead.
Marvin, are the cameras rolling still?
I'm sorry?
Are we still on the air? Yes. We are still on the air. Okay.
Ann Lyko, a member of the press club, and long time ago with USIA, so I was interested in Marvin's.
And please ask.
My question is, in your introduction, you talked about the other half. We've been talking about what Russia should do and we do as a nation, about the connection between Trump and Putin, and I didn't really hear anybody discuss that issue, and I would be interested in all of your thoughts as to whether you think there's something there.
In the sense of what? This collusion, collaboration, or whatever? Yeah, I raised that issue early on about whether it is possible that Putin has something on Trump. And Trump tried a bromance, tried now to sort of fight off more hardline aides and still maintain a relationship with the Russians. He has said any number of times there's nothing wrong with having a good relations with Russia. So what do you think? How, Peter, would you answer that question?
It's not unusual for a new president to come in and say, hey, we need a better relationship with Russia. I'm going to forge a friendship with the Russian counterpart. President Clinton came in and did that with Yeltsin, right? President Bush came in and did that with Putin. Yep. President Obama came in and did that with Medvedev. That's not unusual. What's unusual is having an American president seemingly gush or say such friendly things about a Russian president at the same time the Russian president is seemingly responsible for so many provocations that have challenged our interests both here at home and abroad. And to hear him say to Bill O'Reilly, for instance, well, you know, he's a killer. Well, we're all killers. Or, you know, to have him call after the sham of an election and the talking point is do not congratulate. And he congratulates and says, hey, why don't you come to the White House? within days of sanctioning and expelling diplomats because of a poisoned spy in Britain. It's the disconnect that between the events that are happening in the environment in which this is taking place and the refusal on his part, for the most part, to the last couple of weeks anyway, to say even one hostile thing or one critical thing about Vladimir Putin. It raises questions. Why? And that's why people come up with this, well, there must be something there we don't know.
Yeah.
Mary Louise, what's your take?
The other just fact I would layer on that is the other unusual thing is that it is an unusual number of contacts between the Trump campaign and Russian officials. It's not unusual for an incoming administration trying to figure out what sort of foreign policy it wants to forge, to reach out, to have contacts, to explore things, to have lunch. But this is an unusual level that I haven't seen covering Washington in 15, 20 years. Is there a smoking gun? Not that's been made public yet. The interesting aspects of the Mueller investigation, such as we know, there's a couple of tracks, right? There's the collusion track, and so far, at least publicly, there has been nothing laid out that indicates, if you define collusion as a willful cooperation with Russia to try to sway the outcome of the election by Donald Trump, we haven't seen it, which makes the obstruction of justice investigation almost more interesting. I'll go out and say it's more interesting at this stage. If it were just the collusion investigation, that probably would have been wrapped up by now. It's the steps that have been taken since President Trump came to office, which are now really perplexing to try to understand and explain.
John Allen, how would you answer the question?
I couldn't do better than these two, frankly. In the interest of giving more question opportunities, these were very good answers, frankly.
The thing that is there another questioner that I'm missing? Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Jim Moran. I'd like the panel to address Russia in the larger context of the spread of authoritarianism, whether it be China, Turkey, Hungary, whatever. Candidates to the left of Putin would get about 7% today. Candidates to the right would get 3 times that level of popular support in Russia. So while we focused on Putin, I'd like you to focus on what seems to be the trend in terms of the world politics and the trend towards greater authoritarianism.
Well, just to piggyback on that, and Leon, I'd like to ask your opinion on this, but we find that this, what is called populism, is popular in places like the Philippines, in Egypt, in Hungary, and appears even to be spreading in Western Europe. So what is your take on that?
Well, this is an excellent question. Let me start with the 2 countries you mentioned. We know that Xi Jinping admires Putin. And Xi Jinping is now also a wartime president, meaning he's president for life.
Yes.
Wartime presidents don't quit, and they need wars. This is my concern with Putin. Now, there are 2 other countries in addition to Russia with long, complicated, often tragic histories, and that's China and Turkey. And in both of those places, as in Russia, the people's expectations are increasingly at odds with the economic reality. And what do? In almost the same terms. They are saviors of the nation, that's Erdogan. They are realizers of Chinese national dream, and that is Xi. It is clearly a trend. I think it's different from what's happening in Western Europe or even in Hungary, because there's some semblance of legitimacy. In Western Europe, they so far have not won any elections. Of course, in the Czech Republic and in Hungary, populists did win. But neither Orban nor the forgot the name of the Czech president are saying we are the saviors of the nation. We should grab a piece of the neighboring nation. We should show the United States their place. Whereas in case of Turkey, China, and Russia, countries with very large militaries, very tragic histories on which you could build this narrative of defiance. That is the case, and I think this is a very troubling trend.
Marvin, can I come in on this?
Yes,
though?
John, please.
One of the things that we need to keep in very close mind is that the civilian leadership in democracies, by definition, govern. They don't rule. And what you need to keep in mind, what we all need to watch very carefully is as we see the polarization of politics, we see the rise of populism, we're beginning to see these leaders trending towards seeking to rule rather than to govern. And it looks like the attack of the media, looks like the vilification of the opposition, it looks like the weaponization of institutions, regulatory institutions, the wielding of law enforcement entities through both investigative processes and ultimately the issuance of indictments, et cetera. These are very disturbing trends in democracies when the leaders in those democracies seek no longer to govern but now seek to rule. Now, on the other side of the same coin, if you look at the youth in many of these countries where democracy is under great pressure and where institutions have, the confidence in these institutions has in fact been compromised as a result of the influence operations, there are more youth in many of these countries who are willing to accept order in their lives than necessarily democracy in their lives. So we really have two very pernicious potential influences at work that we need to keep a very close eye on. This would be the role of the media, frankly. The role of the media.
That's great. If I could add in there, first, thank you, Congressman, for the question. Jim and I have known each other now, I hate to say 30 years, something like that, and I'm grateful that he's here. Our experience in Russia, my wife and I were correspondents there at the beginning of the Putin era. My wife went to do a story about a high school history class. She's going to spend the year in the high school history class visiting every few weeks just to check in on them. And the theory of the story was going to be an old Soviet apparatchik kind of teacher who was, struggling with these young, hip kids who wanted to be part of Europe and so forth. And she discovered it was the other way around. That the kids were the ones who had this, nostalgia for an era that they never actually lived in. This idea that the Soviet Union was great and that they wanted to go back to that. Now, never mind you that they were reading Cosmo and that they had, they all wanted to be in business management, right? They all wanted to be, capitalists, actually. They didn't reconcile that, but they took a quiz. Who was right in 1917? And Lenin won in this class of kids. And it was the teacher who was trying to, shake them and say, no, the Soviet Union wasn't great. It was a terrible time for us, and she couldn't get through. So there is this worry that the young generation, that was our experience anyway in Russia, had this illusion of what order meant for them, that does not keep with the reality that many of our generation experienced.
Very, very interesting. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Yes, Link Smith. I'm a member of the National Press Club, retired Navy public affairs officer, and also a radio journalist. And my question relates to personal relationships. President Nixon had one with Leonid Brezhnev. President Reagan had one with General Secretary Gorbachev amidst significant challenges and differences. So here's my question. Could the panel briefly touch on President Trump and President Putin? Do you see the two presidents developing a good relationship personally? And with that, could relations between the two nations improve or not?
Leon?
Yes, in both of your examples, great countries, the leaders of great countries tend to follow national interests. Then, if they follow national interests and national interests coincide, you have good personal relationship. Nixon wanted détente to help with Vietnam, and Brezhnev wanted American wheat, and they had great relationship. Of course, Reagan and Gorbachev had great relationship because in 1987 they both eliminated a whole class of middle strategic nuclear weapons, and Reagan actually believed that Gorbachev was for real, and he was right. He was democratizing the country, and it behooved the American president to be friends. I'm not sure how, after sanction upon sanction upon sanction on Russia, twice bombing Russia's closest ally, Syria, how could these two presidents can have good personal relationship?
I think the environment at this point is just not conducive to this happening. Nobody would trust it because of the things that Leon mentioned, because of the Russia investigation by Mueller, nobody, and Trump actually said this early on in his presidency, look, this environment has made it almost impossible for me to have a good relationship with President Putin because anybody would suspect, in effect, that anything he did that was friendly was motivated by some other concern. So I think, and I think that the problem is, we asked earlier, can things change in 6 years? I think as long as Putin is there,
Yeah.
it's hard to see how the relationship changes. It's very specific to Putin. I don't think it's inevitable that Russia and America are on different paths. I actually think, look back at the first couple years of Obama's presidency. Today we look at the reset as naive and a failure, but the truth is when there was a different Russian leader, that is Medvedev, who was allowed enough rope by Putin, who was still in charge, but allowed enough rope to do things differently. Both publics, the Russian public, the American public, thought very well of each other. We had some deals. We had some coinciding of interests. We saw what it could have been like if there was a different leader. And I think as long as Putin is there right now, I don't think we're going to see a substantial change.
Would like to add something?
No, it's very good.
Okay, the next question, please.
Good evening. My name is Kayla Sharp, and I'm with the Pulitzer Center on Crisis Reporting here in Washington, D.C. And I know that the topic of tonight's conversation is the relationship between U.S. and Russia, but just in these past few weeks, we've seen that the U.S. has seemingly bolstered its decision-making by allying itself with or foreign allies like Britain and France. We've seen this both in the Norwegian attack in England and also with the recent chemical weapons attacks in Syria. So my question is, do you think that this is an effective long-term strategy to continue to rely on the combined force of like-minded foreign allies when it comes to imposing sanctions on Russia?
Mary Louise, you want to start us on that?
Thank you for the question. I mean, and it's an interesting one. You can see what Britain and France have to gain from allying themselves with the US in this moment. Britain, in allying itself with the US with the Syria strikes, for example, finds an area of foreign policy that is not domestically toxic for Theresa May, where she can sell to the British people. The alliance is still there. We're still the bridge between Europe and America. We're the closest ally, and this is something that's ongoing skepticism and hangover of the Iraq War aside, not politically toxic for her. France on board for different reasons, but how can they not be? Whatever the personal relationship, which appears relatively warm between Macron and Trump compared to some other current ally relationships, how can they not? What do they not have to gain by being on board with what remains still the most powerful country in the world? It was interesting being in Russia. I was there as the whole Sergei Skripal Russian spy poisoning was unfolding. And to a person, whether you talk to people who support Putin or not, they were deeply skeptical that Russia is behind this, the same way that to a person they are deeply skeptical that Russia has hacked into foreign systems and is trying to influence US elections or anybody else's. Even as the UK, France, Germany, the US were coming out with the united statement condemning the attacks, and I was saying, what, are they all wrong? Are they all making this up? And they said, yes, they're all NATO allies. You all share intelligence. You're all making it up. End of story. Done.
This may be the last question we'll have time for. Please.
Hello, I'm Gregory Page. I'm a National Press Club member and a former trial attorney for the U.S. Department of Justice. And just wanted to mention that I was intrigued by one of the panelists' reference to a new containment doctrine. And at first blush, or just listening to some of the range of this discussion, it would seem like a new one would be needed because you have Russian money supporting chemical weapons genocide in Syria. You have this new, old Russian nationalism theme that Putin seems to have adopted versus prosperity that seems to be more permanent than just relying on the price of oil, and it depends on disputes with the United States. And then you have territorial expansion in Crimea. And so my question to the panel is, what would a new containment doctrine look like? What do you think it would have to accomplish to be effective?
Leon, it was your idea, so explain it.
Well, again, George Kennan, Long Telegram, classic of American foreign policy, reporting from Stalin's Russia, and it was not unlike, in some key respects, not unlike what's happening today. You know, they were allies. We were allies in the war. And suddenly, Kennan is seeing this strange level of anti-Americanism coming specifically from Stalin. It was the so-called campaign for the Supreme Soviet. And his analysis was very similar. He said, for domestic political reasons, Stalin needs this confrontation with the United States. And obviously, we cannot go to war with Russia. We cannot go with the Soviet Union. I'm sorry. We cannot go to, because they, you know, it's inconceivable. The best we can do is to help our allies on the border of Russia, and eventually NATO came into existence. I would say, my first, I mean, General will speak on that as well. My first, I think, suggestion would be, as soon as possible, put enough conventional force on the eastern flank of NATO that, as Putin manipulates the risks of his domestic versus foreign policy, that he understands that any conventional attack, and it's not rolling the tanks into Riga or Tallinn, it's Crimea too, especially with Latvia and Estonia, where there's 25% of the ethnic Russians. Create a situation along the eastern flank of NATO where Putin is not tempted to test it. That's the first thing I would do as a policy of containment.
My response to that, as time has run out, is wow. I had thought when we were setting up this program that we would be able to leave all of you with the feeling that there is hope, and we will be able to move from the down that we are in now to some kind of up. And the reason is that it simply makes sense. No matter how deep the confrontation may be today, at the end of it, there's going to be a United States and there's going to be a Russia. Both nations will survive, so why don't they use their heads and survive in an intelligent way? And so I go back to my idea. I think it's terribly important that we have starting some kind of exchange. Get that rolling again so that people can feel, to have experiences such as Mary Louise was pointing out before, that the Russians are there and the Americans are here, and let's try to get along. If that sounds terribly naive, forgive me, but that is what I feel. And thank you all so very much for being with us, and especially our panel, which I think was terrific. Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay. Bless you all. That's fabulous.
Ladies and gentlemen, thanks for joining us tonight. Drive carefully going home. Have a great spring, a wonderful summer, and we will hopefully see you in the fall. Thanks. Good night.